Hello, this is Taras Viktorovich Pluskin, currently studying at the University of Florida. And this is just a concept that I've been tossing around in my head for a while and decided just to put some audio notes down for it. And this is mainly a short talk about changing conceptual perceptions when it comes to the final end product of what a seafood item can be. So, for instance, certain fishery species are not suitable for aquaculture because they take a long time to grow. They have a complex larval state, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And for the long time, American lobster has been considered one of these fishery species which is not suitable for aquaculture production. And I would like to kind of challenge that with the idea of changing perceptually what the end product of a lobster is. And this is kind of my proposal for that. So this is production of cocktail lobsters in Long Island Sound. So we'll start with a brief description of the established lobster supply chain of Ameris americanus. So traditionally, Ameris americanus is harvested by the lobstermen in traps. They go off to the wholesaler, also known as a lobster pound, if they're not sold directly from the fishermen, which there's a small percentage that is. Typically, lobsters are then held in either tidal-fed ponds or flow-through systems in these lobster pounds, and then they're sold off sometimes directly to a retailer at that point, or they're shipped off internationally. But sometimes they end up at a secondary wholesaler as well, especially if they're shipped off internationally to areas where the lobster cannot be housed at such high densities. So these guys will typically have a recirculation system and sell live lobster for more money. And then at the retail store, lobsters are pretty unique as far as Western seafood fare, as they are primarily consumed live. At least they're cooked. They're live prior to cooking at the restaurant, which is not common. Typically see that done with fish, for instance, in the West. But the most important part of this is that the premium price is the live lobster, and the idea of lobster and the perception of it below is what you see below, which is about a 1 to 1.5, maybe 2 pound animal that's taken about 6, 7, 8, 9 years, depending on where it's come from to reach that state in its development. It may just be entering sexual competency. It may have been there for maybe a year or two. But this is the expectation, the idea that you will be consuming one or more of these 7 to 8-year-old animals. So this figure isn't terribly up to date, but the general story is historically Long Island Sound was a powerhouse for lobster production up until the 1800s and then the 20th century. There was millions of metric tons of lobsters that were taken out of the Sound. It was an extremely common organism in the days of the colonists, to the point where the popular jibe is that they fed it to prisoners. It was so common back in the day. And then this chart we see here reflects the early 21st century, where there was an event in the very late 20th century, at the end of the 90s, where we had this spike in the lobster population due to whatever beneficial events happened about a decade prior. But there was, again, a sharp collapse and a sharp increase of effort after this point. And since then, the Long Island Sound lobster fishery has remained more of a cultural hallmark than it has anything resembling a functional industrial fishery of any kind. So let's take a quick look at why Long Island Sound was such a powerhouse for lobster production historically, and maybe why it has collapsed and become not so much such a great place for lobsters since. So we look at Long Island Sound here, and essentially we see a perfect estuarine environment. We're fed by several major rivers coming from the continent: the Housatonic, the Connecticut, the Thames, many other minor rivers coming through. We have huge expanses of marshlands, historically stemming all the way into Long Island. We have these huge barrier beaches, and yet huge amounts of intermittent flow coming from the Atlantic Ocean. So we really see here what should be the perfect profile for an extremely productive ecosystem, where we have terrestrial runoff, we have freshwater input, we have some sheltering, yet we do have continuous flushing out and temperature moderation from an oceanic water body. So it's easy to understand how Long Island Sound has been such a massive resource for fisheries production, and why there would be a lot of things for juvenile and adult lobsters to eat. They also like rock reefs in order to settle, so there's a lot of glacier rock reefs dumped around here, especially around the opening of the Atlantic area. So Long Island Sound, for all intents and purposes, should be a place of continual return in the lobster population. In theory, ceasing fishing efforts should be enough to allow the lobster population to rebound. But that is what we're talking about is historical Long Island Sound, not contemporary Long Island Sound. Now we got a picture of Long Island Sound with a little bit of contextualization of the human colonization which has occurred through the industrial, modern, and postmodern era. So we see that most of the huge expanses of marshlands have been replaced with urban zones, especially around Stamford, Norwalk, and then repeated urbanization and domestication on the Long Island part. So we have all this heavy cities forming in Stamford, Norwalk, Bridgeport, New Haven, which are having their own increased human populations, which has increased nutrient runoff. And then we have Long Island, which has a smaller population of richer humans, but they have large expanses of golf fields, they have wine vineyards, they have orchards, they have lawns. All these things require huge nutrient requirements of their own. And they also have a rising population with their own domestic sewage issues. So we have the reduction of filters and the increase of urbanization, the increase of humans. We have the increased destabilization of Long Island Sound directly by chemical inputs because of industrializations which occurred along the Thames rivers. The Thames River hosts Pfizer, Electric Boat, Dow Chemical, among others, historically. Of course, up the Thames River and the Connecticut River, there are also a series of textile mills historically. All these things contribute all kinds of weird, wacky, potent, dangerous, and benign and indifferent chemicals, which affected the lobster populations in different ways. There's always, of course, the post-World War II era of DDT and mass pesticide use, which may have affected the lobster populations and the trophic scales associated with supporting them. Not to mentioning the fact that there's the current use of pesticides and dicyl steroids, neonicotinoids, that all have been used on what agriculture remains in this area. So we have an extreme changing and destabilization of the associated surrounding terrestrial environment, huge direct inputs of anthropogenic nutrients and direct pollutants historically, which are periodically dredged up in high concentrations due to routine dredging activities associated with currently existing industry. And as a result, we can measure changes in Long Island Sound. And one of those things directly, which is really potent, of course, is hypoxic events. So in this figure we see around here, the black areas are areas which have absolutely abyssal seasonal levels of hypoxia, where you just don't have enough flushing. You have high temperatures, which prevent a lot of mixing, and then you have high levels of nutrients, provide a lot of algae production, algae dyes and eutrophication events, and you have deficits in oxygen when all that biomass starts to decay. And we see that this is a growing problem in many coastal and seemingly vitally important productive zones around Long Island Sound. And goodness knows how accurate this figure is and how much it is expanding. So there's a great challenge to truly understand how much of these backwaters are essential for lobster recruitment, because we simply, I think whatever was working historically, we might have changed beyond repair. So I think a lot of the beginning part of this talk is about the fact that there isn't just one solution. There isn't one problem to solve, and there isn't one person to blame. All these results in the collapse of lobster population are a result of human colonization, period. And that's the manifestation of many competing stakeholders. The lobster fishery is easy people to blame because they're directly extracting the lobsters, and surely the removal of broodstock doesn't help. But there's also the everyone else that was basically involved in their direct or indirect activities in reducing the lobster population. And to an extent, it doesn't matter how we can prove how they are responsible historically. It matters how we can move forward now. But all of these groups collectively do have some vested interest in retaining the lobster population because it is such an important cultural hallmark of the area, not to mention its inherent economic value. But in order to find a solution, you really do have to reconcile these competing stakeholders. Because you can't move Millstone power plant, and you can't move electric boat. So whatever solution, you can't stop shipping out of London Harbor. And so whatever solution that you come up with, you really need to find a way to have it be pastoral, find a way to fit in a niche within the existing human colonization, or find a way to change the human colonization so that it can work better with the natural resource to foster the flourishment of both. So with the historical context of the collapse of the Long Island Sound lobster fishery in mind, let's look at potential management options. Option number one is do nothing. Let the Long Island Sound industry become a novelty of the past, and do it is being done right now, buying lobsters from the successful Maine and Canada fisheries while they still exist. But culturally, this is most likely unsustainable, as I for one, don't believe in a future of Long Island Sound where children know for a fact that there are no lobsters left inside of the entire water body. I fail to believe that, and I fail to want that to be the future of my children. So let's look at the other options. You can limit trap effort, which makes the fishermen angry. It's economically unsustainable. I think to a degree that needs to be taken into effect, but we really are talking about root causes which are interrupting, if not collapsing, the lobster recruitment. You can limit terrestrial runoff with improved sewage treatment plants. This has got to be done at some state if people are ever going to be sincere about truly improving the health of their estuarine ecosystems. But these are extremely, this is expensive infrastructure to raise in a time where, obviously with the pandemic, public resources are going to likely be allocated to other places. You could put increased pressure on predator species. There's been a rise in sea bass populations, but the sea bass that are of legal size are not the ones that are attacking the lobster juveniles. It's the very aggressive small juvenile sea bass that are illegal to keep. So unless you do some sort of change in reconciliation and management with sea bass, that's likely not to work. And then there's stock enhancement, which historically has a long history, but requires a stable environment to work. And it requires some way of quantifying return on public funds, because historically it's been a lot of dumping lobster larvae in as little potato chips for the surrounding fish. But perhaps today we can really explore some avenues for actually full-fledged farming and ranching, where we make some sort of a new approach. And then lastly is research. We have new mounting issues such as epizootic shell disease and many other issues that are emerging with lobsters that just require baseline research so that we can learn more about the causes of lobster failed recruitment and find ways to bring back the population, hopefully. So I think the frank reality is that the degree of which human colonization has changed the terrestrial and estuarine environments of Long Island Sound is radical. We have changed it to a radical degree in which that we have terraformed um, this land. Thus, perhaps some radical management options are due if we really are going to deal with lobsters in the reality that we've made Long Island Sound into. The first is what I call the Martha's Vineyard model, where Martha's Vineyard operates a series of public-run hatcheries, which produce cohogs in ways that would never be economically sustainable if they were farming them. But it's because they sell licenses and they recognize that there's a cultural sustainability level, which people are allowed to hunt for the cohogs. The cultural relevance of that has an economic value, which is much exceeds that of just the shellfish as a commodity. So perhaps that could be adopted with the lobsters, where you just have a purely recreational fishery of just people buying licenses for pots, where there is no industrial fishery for commercial scale production, but where lobsters still exist and can be observed from the needs of like how other species such as trout are observed and managed. And then the other management option is pretty radical that we'll be talking about today is modifying the lobster consumer habits, moving away from the big steamed 8-9-year-old animal and moving towards a smaller product, a smaller individual that can actually feasibly be produced in an aquaculture setting and therefore be produced in a sustainable way and be produced in a way that you have a population of farmed individuals that are meant for human consumption so that you can purely focus on allowing the wild population to rebound. So in the previous picture, I showed a raw bar platter, which had a raw little necks and cohogs. And that's really what we're trying to talk about at this point, is that, when oysters became economically unsustainable on the mass harvest model, when they were just canned and shipped across the world and were this cheap, delicious seafood resource, when that became economically unsustainable, the conception of oyster consumption changed towards the raw bar market, where individual oysters were aquacultured. They were sold at a smaller size, a younger size, and the conception was changed so that they could be sold at a higher price and a smaller size. So with that in mind, I would like to present to you a Langostino, which is a Scandinavian cocktail lobster-like decapod crustacean. So these guys live in the deep waters off of Norway. They're Nefris nerops, and these guys are trapped in a fishery, and they are, I believe, Norway's highest valued fishery item, salmon being their highest value aquaculture organism. So these guys are served next to sea scallops in kind of a raw bar platter, and they're not very big, as you can see. These are about as big as they get, so these were very, very, very expensive, kind of like king ones. But we can see how already there's already an established market overseas for a smaller cocktail-like lobster. So there is already a small route for what we'll be discussing. So with that in mind, let's start to discuss the prospects of adopting the Langostino cocktail lobster model to Homarus americanus, our American lobster. So the core objectives of kind of this sketched out 5-year plan I just kind of thought of is so you can demonstrate, the idea is to demonstrate the capacity to mariculture and sea ranch this lobster. Basically, find a way to take buried females, conduct the hatchery operations, get juveniles after metamorphose, and then find a way to sea ranch them out to 1 year of age, and then see how big they are, and then see how you could maybe increase that and see if that size is acceptable for marketing. So the second thing is to, of course, monitor the production and evaluate how successful and how expensive this would be. And if the pilot production was successful, you could introduce 1-year-old lobsters through the consumer, probably through some novel restaurant deals, and then you can begin to train additional producers. So here's a brief sketch out for a 5-year plan. The first year, you would focus mainly on hatchery production towards the post-larval state, which would have its own inherent bottlenecks. You'd have to get a facility that knew how to competently raise lobster larvae at scale, which has its own art and science aspects to it, but though it has been done, so it's far from impossible. And then you'll have to raise a core set of initial personnel in a site which will be able to competently produce lobster larvae year after year to support the rest of the chain of the operation. In year 2, you'd have to refine that hatchery production, trying to fix what went wrong, because something always goes wrong in a hatchery production, refine that production. But you'd want to focus your abilities on nursery and grow out survivorship of your first and second and perhaps third cohorts at that point, and focus on evaluation and just what are the bottlenecks for their survival up until that part where they're starting to enter sea ranching. Then at year 3, you're going to want to define, refine the hatchery production again, refine the nursery, improve on what you've already done at that point, train additional producers. You're going to get some additional thought and additional support going in at this point. The idea is to support a community-based industry. Then you're going to want to introduce whatever cocktail lobsters you've been able to produce at this point through sea ranching, through a series of exclusive restaurant deals. So try and get them to sell to people that are already used to taking a risk at a place like Matunic Oyster Bar, or something like that, where they're used to taking a risk on new novel seafood items for a higher price, and they'll know that they'll be delicious. Then you can also, at year 4, you're going to need to refine overall production, everything that you've done together, and you'll need to coordinate your producers. And you really want to flood the market at this point as much as possible. Really produce as many of these cocktail lobsters as you can to try and get as many people to try them as possible so that you can get a loyalty base going, so you can have consumer demand. And once you have consumer demand, the rest should follow organically. At year 5, you really want to evaluate the overall costs and see really what the economic bottlenecks are. Though from the start, you really want to try it on a minimal scale, because at the end of the day, this ideally would be an operation for existing lobstermen to be able to transition into with their existing resources. This is a list of key stakeholders that would have to be organized: research institutions such as NOAA, state universities, mariculture facilities, people that are actually on the ground that are, most likely you're going to have some sort of commercial shellfish hatchery manager that's going to be able to, or marine biologist that's going to be able to produce large amounts of lobster post larvae. You'll need watermen, probably lobstermen and oyster farmers, your best resource for having resources on the water. They're your eyes to the water. They'll be able to maintain and take care of lobsters in the sea ranch setting better than anyone on a daily basis, because they're out in the water on a daily basis. And then you're also going to need officials, because all of this, the very concept of this involves, it would be illegal at the moment to sell an aquacultured lobster at this size. Doesn't matter if it is aquacultured or not. Doesn't matter if an oyster is aquacultured. It still has to be sold at a certain size in Mystic. In Connecticut, rather, because it's not yet a clear delineation between a wild and an aquacultured shellfish crop. Restaurateurs would have to be recruited because they're the ones that are going to be producing and sensationalizing your cocktail lobsters and their raw bar menus. And then, of course, your most vital stakeholders, the people of Long Island Sound, because it's their power, the consumer, that will make this possible or make it not possible, simply put. And it will be the extreme influence of coastal landowners and their sway over those resources that would make this form of ranching even possible in the first place. So it's their culture and it's their choice. So it would be up to them at the end of the day. But all these groups would benefit should the idea work. Here's a list of relevant management authorities that would have to be relevant. You'd have to report to, oh gosh, all these people. Oof. So I'll sum this up with some kind of summarized finer nuts and bolts of the production. So part one would be broodstock selection and collection. You'd use your resources of the lobstermen. They'd be able to be the ones that would be trapping these buried females and bringing them to you. Then the hatchery would have to house these females until they hatch. And it would be a far stretch into the future before any aquaculture individuals would be old enough to be broodstock themselves. So this would be the model for the foreseeable future, where you'd have to depend on existing fishermen to hunt down these buried females for larval production, which would have its own sustainability issues. Part two would be the hatchery. This would require the hatchery personnel to raise the larvae all the way through its various instar phases. They'd have to culture various live feeds and make sure that they have the right fatty acid profile. There would probably be many avenues for improvement. When this was originally done, it was about the turn of the century, and they were using paddle wheels from Brown University to aerate. So obviously, there hasn't been a tremendous amount of effort in lobster hatchery aquaculture, though it has been done by people and is still being done by people. But there are a few avenues that could be exploited, such as green water techniques, which have been effective for various finicky reef species, and new live feeds, such as copepods, which are smaller and are more confident retaining PUFAs. And then novel tank designs, because cannibalism is an issue with these guys, even in the larval state, and you'd have to be clever, probably referring to what people do for perhaps mud crab hatcheries in Southeast Asia. Part three would be nursery production. Once you had a stable tank-raised juvenile, post-larvae, um, they would be placed inside some sort of a ranching structure that would be placed inside the water, where they would enjoy the free flow of the surrounding water bodies, and they would be structured away from predators, and they would be prevented from escaping, and they would not be forced to be penned up with each other in too high of densities. So that's the big issue with lobster aquaculture, is the fact that the juveniles will predate on each other, and it is very difficult to keep them in tanks without them actually aggressively killing each other. So this is the place for the most innovation, but this is also the place where I think the watermen and the fishermen are the biggest resources, because they'll be able to figure out the best places to place these lobster pens where these juveniles will survive. And something else which has been really cool that's been developed is that it's been found out that various fouling organisms, the tunicates, the polychaete worms, and the like to foul lobster cages, are pretty ideal food for juvenile lobsters. So as long as they're given the right location for water quality and they're shielded from predators, this really is a mechanism that these guys can potentially be used to get them to 1 year of age. And then grow out is kind of the bigger issue. This would be larger scale cages, which you would use to bring these guys to 1 year of age. Is eventually they'll most likely outgrow anything that's space effective for the nursery scale. So they'll ideally be brought up into maybe 1 to 3 class stages of cages. But as they get larger, the risk of predation does decrease significantly, and they can be grown up, like I said, for this pilot program to at least 1 year of age. So we'll assess how large they are at that point for marketing as a cocktail product. Then also vital is the monitoring and evaluation of success, with several key bottlenecks, criteria, the number of post larvae that can be produced from the hatchery and enter the nursery effectively, the percent survivorship of those juveniles leaving the nursery and enter the ranching system. So after they potentially leave maybe a tertiary intermittent tank stage, how long will it take for them to enter the ranching system? And the percent of juveniles that will survive the ranching system to live to 1 year of age and be marketable as cocktail lobsters. And then how large they are at 1 year of age and what their body condition is, and how it is most suitable to sell them at 1 year of age. So the marketing campaign, this would be, hopefully you have a lot of 1 year old lobsters and they're of a good body condition and they're ready to be sold. You want to assess what their minimum carapace length is, what their meat to shell ratio is. Maybe if you want to grow them out a little bit longer, or maybe even harvest them a little bit earlier to increase the rate of production. And then one other thing that's interesting to consider is, potentially at that size, it's a lot of effort to shuck them. Perhaps you want to harvest them after they molt. You can fry them whole as a soft shell product, which is relatively, it would be a novel item, but you could fry the whole lobster and put it perhaps in a po' boy sandwich, and that would be a way to novelly sell smaller size lobster, and potentially a very cost effective one. So I just wanted to thank anyone that happened to listen to this talk, and just wanted to offer this possible conceptual change in how lobsters are consumed in Long Island Sound, because the reality is the lobster fishery that once was is gone and lost forever, and if it is recoverable, it won't be so possible until perhaps the time of my grandchildren. So in return, perhaps we should do like what we did with the oysters and recontextualize our consumption of this organism for the now and the present, and allow ourselves to sustainably aquaculture individuals that can be consumed by humans so that the wild populations can be given a darn break. So thank you all very much, and I hope you all are safe during these troubling months.